This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 29. Which creates growth, supply or demand?
So Donald Trump wants to create jobs in the US by cutting taxes, and his assumption is obviously that if he puts more money into people's pockets, that's going to increase their spending power, so they buy more things, and in so doing they create more jobs. But isn't that counter to how many economists see the world? They believe that actually supply creates demand. If you create jobs, people have money to buy things, and that creates demand. So which comes first, supply or demand? Obviously, there's a bit of a circle involved, but if the circle isn't moving fast enough, which one do you need to give a nudge to? Well, let's ask Professor Steve Keen for his view on this. Is Trump right? More money in the pocket will create more jobs?
This is the ultimate chicken and egg question, as you say, in economics. And mainstream economics, its reference point is a dear old little bloke called Jean-Baptiste Say, and French, well, clearly French, and a great fan of Adam Smith. Yep. But also, ironically, had a theory of economics which is completely the opposite of the theory of economics that Smith had. Became a correspondent of Ricardo's, and Ricardo equally had a completely opposite theory of economics. But they both, Ricardo accepted Say's argument that supply creates demand. And that's the side of the mainstream way of thinking. Along comes Donald, and he's now saying effectively the demand creates supply. Yet again, because anything a mainstream economist believes, the simplest thing to do is believe the opposite. And in this case, Donald's right. Demand creates supply in a monetary economy because we live in a monetary economy. And this vision of supply creating demand is a barter economy vision of how the world operates. And the change is enormous. So it's worth talking about this one in detail.
Right. OK. So, look, I've been in business for a long time. And one of the great dangers in business is this idea of, and particularly in technology businesses, of build it and they'll come. Yeah. So to me, it seems completely counter to logic because you spend a lot of money and you can't assume that customers are going to, you build something that people want rather than create something and assume people are going to buy it. And yet it seems like, that whole theory that you're talking about from economists is built around that. I mean, pure and simple, build it and they'll come, but they won't if they don't want it.
Yeah, I mean, this is because what you're actually after is money. And the ironic thing, if you look actually at Say's original arguments about this, saying supply creates its own demand, he actually said merchants don't want money. No, they don't want money. They're after the goods and services they can buy. Right. So therefore, you can ignore the money thing completely. And he actually said, for it is not desired in ordinary circumstances to conceal it. We do not consume money, and it is not desired in ordinary circumstances to conceal it. What a load of bollocks.
Well, we do want money, but we want money for what we can do with it.
No, well, that's partly where the error comes in. We actually want money because we want money. If you look at a capitalist economy, what people are at is accumulating is they want to die with as many as one of my great old lecturers, Ted Wheelwright, used to say that there's a golden rule in capitalism: he who has the gold makes the rules, and the person who dies with the most gold wins. And in that basis, there's no way that Donald Trump possibly could, but there's no way that Bill Gates, for example, could consume everything he's worth now, roughly $100 billion, before his death in any conceivable fashion in which he enjoyed any of the benefits of that consumption activity. Right. He's going to die with the most gold, therefore he wins. And the idea that we don't want the money and we don't try to conceal it, for God's sake. You try asking a Donald Trump what his tax returns and income levels are and cash levels are right now. So it says original propositions were an utter load of bollocks, but they just made this point that if you supply it, they will come, in the sense that if you make lots and lots of microphones, you want to sell them all, so you dump them on the market to get whatever exchange rate you can get in terms of exchanging somebody else's apple output or pig output. And that's the basis of Say's logic. But the reality is, unless people have got money they go, okay, to buy, you're not going to sell those microphones. And so the demand is the originator. It's the expenditure creates income, not the other way around. And I can give, it's not simple for radio, but I can give a fairly simple illustration of this. People might be getting a headache if they try this. Maybe pull over if you're in a car listening at the moment. Can I give it a try?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
we're
Okay.
all ears.
Just draw up a 3x3, like a little. Imagine you've got what do they call that game? A Sudoku.
Yep.
You're drawing up Sudoku, but it's 3x3 rather than 9x9, so it's much simpler. And on the rows you've got Tom, Dick, and Harry, and on the columns you've got Tom, Dick, and Harry. And where Tom and Tom meet up, that's what Tom spends on Dick and Harry. So if you have if you're spending $100,000 a year on Dick and Harry, then there's a minus 100,000 where Tom and Tom intersect, and then for Tom and Dick and Tom and Harry on that row, it's a plus 40 for Tom, for Dick, and plus 60 for Harry. The rows necessarily sum to zero.
Yeah.
And you do the same thing for Dick and the same thing for Harry. And you've got a 3x3 where the diagonal tells you what the spending is. It's got a negative sign. On the horizontal tells you where the money is spent. That's the positive sign. One is expenditure, the other is income. Now, you actually add up each of the columns. What you're saying is what's the difference between what Tom is spending and what he's earning from Dick and Harry. And if you all start off as balanced, so you're spending 100,000 on them and they're effectively spending the same on you, you get three sets of zeros. So nobody's saving money. Yeah. Now, if somebody in that group wants to save money, let's say Tom wants to save money by cutting his spending from 100,000 to 90, then what's going to happen is that his little negative box goes from minus 100 to minus 90, hoping that his other two go up to 10. But because he's spending $10,000 less on Dick and Harry, they're earning $10,000 less. What's actually gone down as income, not. So in the aggregate, the income falls by the amount somebody tries to save.
Right.
So, the expenditure drives income. And that situation, if you don't have the money being generated, and that's where the role of banks and governments come in creating money that enables to spend, unless that's being spent, you won't get the income in the first place. So expenditure does drive income.
Right. So putting it another way, savings is a leakage to the system, isn't it? Everything's going around in the circle. This
is the other great myth. I mean, people talk about saving, and the thing is, Tom could actually save money out of that. Okay, Tom's expenditure could fall by more than the impact on Tom's income was affected. So Tom, by doing that exercise, could have, the spending goes down to 90,000. The income could go. With spending was 100,000. Income was 100,000. Then he goes to spend 90. Maybe his income falls to 95, and he saves $5,000 more in money in his individual account. But when you start with this model, if you start with a set amount of money in the economy, you cannot generate that more money out of Tom, Dick, and Harry. It takes either a bank off to one side or a government off to the other, injecting money in for actual aggregate amount of money to change. So the idea that because we can save at the individual level, one of the many fallacies of composition in analysing the macroeconomy is just to simply transfer that to the macro level and think if everybody saves, there'd be more money. No, saving does not create money. Saving accumulates it in your individual account out of the money that exists, but it does not create the money in the first instance. Therefore, the aggregate cannot save, whereas the individual can. Once we've got that straight, a lot of things change.
Okay, cool. Sort of get that. Okay, so look, so in answer the question, which comes first, demand or supply? The answer is clearly demand comes first. Yep. But there's a time lag as well, isn't there? And this is one of the other great failings of economics. So to say that, we're going to cut tax enormously, so there's going to be a lot more money in people's bank accounts, therefore they've got more money that they're going to spend. They're going to save some of it as well, of course, because I'd argue part of the reason we save is for security, not because we want money per se, but because we want to make sure that we've got enough money to last our life and live comfortably in our old age. And I'm sure that's a big factor in all of it, rather than necessarily wanting to be as rich as Donald Trump. But that aside, if I've got more money sitting in my bank account and I can spend more, that's not automatically going to create jobs because particularly within that country, because the things I want to buy might not exist. There might not be people producing it or producing enough of it, and so it might create imports before it creates anything for the domestic economy.
Oh, that's true. Again, this is the issue about where does the money end up going.
Yeah.
And if you try to stimulate spending in a national economy where there's a large amount of importing going on, then the stimulus might go across to imports more so than it goes to the domestic economy. And that's a constraint on the behaviour of governments in terms of creating money and banks as well. But of course, governments have got a responsibility about it, banks don't. Right. So huge amount of the money being created, obviously in Iceland when they had banks generating enough debt that it was equivalent to 10 times the GDP of the country, then a lot of that it went up being into massive imports by Iceland as well. So you do have these interlinkages, but they all start from the demand side. Where's the money coming from? And the answer is it comes from governments and banks.
Yeah. It almost has to come from overseas, doesn't it? At least initially, and maybe that's something you need to be aware of if you're going to say, well,
not overseas. It comes from non-market participants. This is the thing that people don't get their heads around, because they're still thinking in a barter sense about the economy, because it's what economists themselves do, the mainstream. But the money itself in an economy is not generated by the participants in it. We don't create money. If we do, we go to jail for counterfeiting. The people who create the money are either banks, which are they're essential part of the economic system, but you can't make money in the same way that banks don't make money in the same way that factories make output. Okay, they make money through the social privilege of being allowed to credit our deposit accounts when they write a debt against us at the same time. It's letting their double entry bookkeeping create money, which is the social privilege they have that enables them to make this stuff. Governments do it because they have the social privilege of being the government, and they can declare that this money is acceptable in paying taxes within this realm and acceptable in paying debts as well, and we then use it for that reason. So they're fundamentally not market participants. And even when you look at international trade, it's not domestic. If you have an export surplus, then when you present the dollars you've earned for selling your English product overseas, that goes to the central bank, and the central bank then credits your account and the reserve accounts of the bank you bank with English pounds. And that's another way to create English pounds. So there's all outside the actual economy of England.
Right. But if I have more cash and I want to buy stuff, and the stuff is, presumably right now, companies make enough to satisfy current demand. If you increase that demand, those factories have got to either tool up to increase, or new companies can emerge to try and grab some of those extra pounds that are in circulation. In the meantime, people have got to...
Now you've tacked onto another topic which we better raise at some point. What capacity is the normal level of capacity that firms operate at? And the reality is, in a capitalist economy, for very good reason, firms operate with excess capacity.
Yeah, okay. So they can respond quickly. Yeah.
It can respond very quickly. And for that reason, it isn't a necessity that if we have a dramatic increase in demand domestically, then bang, it'll have to come in through imports, because we're working flat chat, which is, again, conventional economic theory. No, the reality is most firms have got 10 to 20% of spare capacity sitting there for very good competitive reasons. And when there's an increase in demand, they just hire more workers if necessary. They certainly buy more inputs. And there is a time lag in those sorts of responses, but the industrial capacity is there in a capitalist economy.
Okay, so just finishing off then, just looping this back to Donald Trump, because it sounds like he's got another Donald Trump idea that we quite like. The only downside on this, and we've touched on this before, is that Donald Trump believes that this extra demand is going to be enough to create enough new business that they'll be able to, that'll create enough new jobs that's going to enable people, the Laffer curve, in other words, that we talked about, it's going to create enough demand. There's going to be new jobs with new people paying tax, and that new tax is going to cover the loss in taxes by dropping tax in the first place.
It's going to cause a budget deficit, which, as I've said before, is a sensible thing for an economy to run, depending upon the scale of its international trade book. And America, as a reserve currency, doesn't even need to worry about that. So Donald's got that capacity there well and truly.
Right. Whether he can convince his Republican comrades that or not is another question, isn't it, for another day. All right, Steve, which comes first? I love it when we have an answer. Which comes first, demand or supply? Demand is the answer. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Good to talk.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And whether he can push ahead with that idea, of course, depends on whether he can get the US debt ceiling raised. That could be a major gridlock for him this week. That's the Debunking Economics podcast. Once again, I'm Phil Dobbie. We'll catch you again soon. Thanks for listening.